Recorded at Get a Grip Studios in Toronto, Canada. A Get a Grip management production and in association with the Get a Grip on Lighting podcast. Financially supported by the National Association of Innovative Lighting Distributors and presented by the National Lighting Bureau, the Illuminating Engineering Society, and the International Dark Sky Association. Added to the IES's 2021 Progress Report. This is Starving for Darkness, a podcast. Hey folks, before we get into Starving for Darkness here, my co-host from the Get a Grip on Lighting podcast, Gregory Eric, and I are going to tell you real quick about some magicians we know at Evluma. That's evluma.com. And you hover over products, that's right, and click on Dark Sky Friendly, Greg. You got to check out the magicians at Evluma, evluma.com, Greg Eric.
How many lighting manufacturers, I should say, are actually doing this? None, other than Evluma. They're the only ones that are actually focusing on it, putting product out there and saying, hey, we're going to tackle this issue head on, and we have product for you. They cover it right there. You'll see it on the website. Kelvin temperature. They've got them all. 2K up to 5K.
2K,
Lensing.
not 27K. 2K, brother.
And they have 22K.
Yeah.
You know, that's something that not everybody has, or not anybody has. Lensing. Diffusion, shields, and then dimming. Of course, you want dimming. You always talk about it, the importance of that in exterior lighting. They've got it all with their products.
You got to go to evluma.com, hover over products, and click Dark Sky Friendly Lighting. Right now, here comes Starving for Darkness.
Hello, listeners and darkness lovers. Welcome to another episode of Starving for Darkness. We're so excited to have our guest today, James Karl Fischer. Dr. Fischer operates the Zoological Lighting Institute, ZLI, a 501c3 dedicated to supporting the sciences of light and life through the arts for animal welfare and wildlife conservation. Former council member of the Royal Institute of British Architects, Dr. Fischer advocates for the integration of biodiversity loss mitigation strategies in architecture by calling attention to the importance of natural light cycles for all living things. Dr. Fischer, it's a pleasure to have you on the show today. Thank you so much. And we start every episode with the same request. Could you please tell us about a dark sky experience that left you with a feeling of awe?
I can, and thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here too. I want to start off by saying that I'm really thrilled. Yes, well, feeling of awe. I think the way I'm going to describe the most stunning experience for me actually had to do with my students. I used to teach at the New School, just briefly, but I would take my students out to an observatory. It's called the Jenny Jump Observatory near the Pennsylvania border of New Jersey. And I would forbid them flashlights, to start. So after we parked the car, we would walk along a gravel path, and on one side of the path there was a drop of about 50 feet, and on the other was a slope up with trees on either side. And because of the trees, you couldn't see the stars. All you could really see was maybe a little glimmer of light far off in the distance, especially after coming out of the car. You have like the phones and things like that people are using. Anyway, the feeling of awe, it actually had to do with the release of anxiety. The students were always terrified. And the lesson I would give them was very clear. I said, look, if you hear crunching under your foot, it means you're on gravel. If you don't hear crunch, you're not on gravel. Move back to the gravel. Right? And we would walk about maybe, let's say about 100 meters, right, under this tunnel of trees. At the beginning, they were terrified, right? By the time we got to the end, the tunnel opens up and you have the observatory there and the telescopes of, all the different universities and clubs in New Jersey there. But you could see the stars and it would just open everything out. And you still didn't have any artificial light whatsoever. All you had were stars and sky, but the students' eyes would be adjusted, and so that anxiety was released. So the awe, I would say, in this point, it's not that like being in touch with something. That's not really the experience I'm talking about. The experience was just being released from that pain of anxiety that was caused by the inverted relationship of light. You know, that like when it's gone, you feel better. It's just a question of getting to that moment. So that would be my story, I think, to kind of set things up too, for what, I'd love
Wow.
to talk about today.
I think that's such a great story because
Mm-hmm.
it really talks about the experience that most people are feeling with regard to light addiction, which is that there's a bit of a barrier or a gateway to get from the bright thinking mind to the dark thinking mind. And that gateway is actually a few minutes. And it can really take people a little bit of time to experience the benefits of darkness and to see that shift and feel it. So I love the story in the way that you describe it, which goes through people's initial fears, but then realizing that there's an amazing benefit that we're really forgetting. So that's a fantastic story. And I want to jump in now to your work. Can you describe the purpose and function of the Zoological Lighting Institute?
I can. The purpose is essentially to provide support for applied photobiology research. We have a mission that we crafted that says supporting the sciences of light and life through the arts for animal welfare and wildlife conservation. But we set it up as a 501c3 as a way to give money and to find funding for this kind of work because we found it was lacking. And in part, it was to improve animal care, but it was also set up to ensure that the photobiological work that was done, well, let's just say correctly, without being arrogant about it. But we wanted to make sure that the biological studies were based in physical optics, in physical light, and electromagnetic radiation, physical terms, rather than industry standards, which weren't really appropriate to the field. So the purpose of ZLI, if I say it again, would be to find funding to guide the research. It wasn't simply just to fund anything. It was to guide the research in ways that you could make better decisions, either with regard to animal care in zoos and aquariums, or with regard of environmental development, like architecture or landscape. Because the metrics that were being used, they were more, I think, statistical is a good way to say it. With correlations that may or may not have been correct or understood. So that was really the purpose of ZLI, was to find that funding to guide the research so that decision making could be improved.
I love that because
Mm-hmm.
I do think that there's so much that's left on the table with a statistic. And your work gets into the mental health of animals. And I think that that's the type of thing statistically you would never understand through a statistic.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a really important lens that you begun with. And so the ZLI has four endeavors or pursuits, and they are photosciences research, film and media, sustainable design, and education. And photosciences research, can we start there? What is exactly the research that you're doing with this pursuit?
Well, with ZLI, we actually don't do research ourselves. I have to
Hmm.
be really clear about that. We support the research. But that being said, the simple fact of organizing the photosciences guides, like it structures the research. So in a way, we are kind of, setting the experiments in the way that we describe it. And that would be surrounding what we call the ZLI framework. I say Z, sometimes I say C, sometimes I say Z because we're international. So again, and I started in the UK, so it was ZLI there, and in the US it's
Hmm.
ZLI. But with this framework that we set up, because we wanted to make sure we were being comprehensive in providing funding, and that we really built something worthwhile, we divided the photosciences into three categories. Photophysiology, essentially how light affects the body. And in this, we divided that further into three categories of biophysics, biochemistry, and bioluminescence, which is a little weird to think of that as separate from the other two. But those three really make up photophysiology. The second category in our framework is the sensory ecology. And there we look at visual ecology, how eyes function, because it's going to be, and how eyes function in relation to a whole organism, because it's going to be different for different species in terms of how that overall mechanism works, right? And then there's animal coloration. And then finally, we have cross-sensory modalities, the ways that one sensory input in an animal might affect another. So that's sensory ecology, those three categories. And coloration is part of that because it gets into fitness relationships and how those work. The third category, we struggled with the title, but eventually we settled on integrative biology, integrative photobiology. And there, we're really looking at three categories. We're looking at community resourcing. That is to say, how animals and human animals relate to other animals because of light, right? And community resourcing, because most often that focuses on food and predator-prey relationships. There are other aspects too, but that's the main one. The second category is epidemiology, looking at how disease vectors occur, how disease is both impacted in terms of its severity, but also its spread. So we look at the relationship of light under that epidemiological category. And then the final category here is phenology, time. Time is actually governed by light in nature. I know, now we look at things like cesium atoms, right? As a universal metric, but it's actually a standard that's very removed from how ecological systems work or how animals will use time as a resource. So this phenological component, it makes up the third category. It speaks to things like seasonality, day cycles, sequences, of light, and how the sequences of natural light impact living processes, whether it's biological or ecological. We say integrative biology as the title of this category because we want to take that ecological investigation of light and put it into a biological format where we understand the underlying process at this individuated level as well. So those are the three categories: photophysiology, sensory ecology, and integrative biology. Those are our three categories. And so the photosciences department really offers grants and scholarships in each of those categories when we get applications. But the overall idea is to build up a, not necessarily our own library, but to build up research in these fields. And quite frankly, we look at that framework as a standard for photobiological study. Because what we were finding is that when developers or lighting designers or architects, or animal care specialists in a zoo or aquarium, when they wanted to research something about light, there were all of these different categories scattered through paywalls and university levels, and it wasn't organized. So I always say, to anybody who comes into ZLI, I say, this is the most important thing we have, because it's like crafting a plan. If you craft that plan, then you can achieve goals. So that framework gives us specific focal points to build up these applied photobiological knowledge, the applied photobiological knowledge. So that's photosciences.
In our correspondence, you had mentioned that there were 3 initiatives that you have going on right now that you wanted to unpack. Let's talk about the Zala animal welfare stations. First of all, what is ZALA? And then describe the Zala animal welfare stations.
I can. Well, Zala stands for Zoo and Aquarium Lighting Assessment. Zoo and Aquarium Lighting Assessment. And we chose that because obviously Zala is a very cool zoo-y kind of sounding name, right? But it also focuses, with the Zala stations are an attempt to franchise and monetize animal welfare monitoring in an independent way. So it's a franchise, is the way we're conceiving this. And so the Zala Station, the idea of a Zala Station is that animal welfare monitoring, which is fairly common in zoos and aquariums, we put it on a schedule. So it's a 24/7 endeavor, just like you would have enrichment or other, serious, efforts. And with those animal welfare metrics, we actually prioritize light in that. So, and a typical animal welfare metric, well, I'll say the best ones because it's obvious what we think are best. The 5 domains of animal welfare. It's a document that came out in the 90s, and it's been worked on since then. But each of their criteria speaks to an aspect of welfare for animals. And this includes humans too at the end of the day. But it includes nutrition, health, environment, and then behavior, right? And there are metrics for each of those that you can measure on a regular basis. The mental domain is the last in the original formulation. So, but it doesn't have metrics, right? In the current scheme. What we did for Zala, and when I say we, I mean Xavier Villanova, Claudia Tay. They're really the key people with me on this. What we did is that we looked at these 5 domains and the existing metrics. The Wildlife Reserve Singapore has an amazingly good animal welfare metric. There's a couple. Detroit Zoo in the US has a very good one. But what we did, we looked at the 5 domains and we said, well, wait a minute. We have this mental domain that everyone says is difficult to quantify, right? And we said, well, how do we quantify that? What do we mean by all of this? So we wrote a piece called Enlightenment that started exploring some of these issues because we're not afraid to admit we don't know something and we want to go forward, right? So we looked at that and we said, well, if we're talking about mental health, mental domain, the mental well-being, right? We're talking about consciousness, right? And there's another document, and I know this can get to be a bit much, so this will be the last external document I refer to. The Cambridge Declaration of Consciousness came out in 2012, and it essentially recognized non-human animal life as being conscious because the physical mechanisms were the same, but they were located in perception, right? Not back of house. It's located in consciousness is located in perception. So for our part, the first thing that we said was, well, wait a minute. If it's in perception, what's being perceived, right? And of course, for us, that's light, right? So, it's other things too. But if we're talking about
light and
consciousness,
darkness. Like darkness is perceived as well?
we actually don't use the word darkness.
Okay.
We just look because we come at this, and it's a good. Believe me, I understand why. But like we come in as physicists, so starlight is as much light as sunlight. It's just a different order of magnitude, right? And it has different, you could look at all different kind of parameters, but we just say it's the same thing. It's just it's like I know we say cold and hot, but temperature isn't fundamentally different at minus 20 degrees as it is at plus 20 degrees. It's still temperature, right? Light's kind of the same way. So what we started thinking about in terms of this mental domain is that, well, wait a minute, at these lower orders of magnitude of light, right? That's actually habitat. That's being perceived by animals that function very well at those levels. Most animals do function much better like after twilight than they do during the day. And so we started looking at that saying, okay, but wait a minute. The perceptual mechanisms for every animal are going to be a little different too. And they're going to function differently. So, I know in the lighting industry, they talk about scotopic and photopic vision, right? Those got to be very popular words. But it speaks to something very significant. It says that, in, say, those lower light levels, eyes are functioning and the nervous system that's behind the eyes and the hormones behind all that, they're functioning differently than they do in the day. Now, this is a bit of a twist. We don't need to do this for our animal welfare monitoring, but I'm going to throw it in here because this is the place to talk about it. If we're going to talk with Cambridge and say that, speak along with Cambridge, and we say that, well, all animals are conscious, right? Well, if I'm talking about human consciousness, I can talk about states of consciousness and modes of consciousness. Why wouldn't I do that with non-human animals, right?
Absolutely.
And it's because like we don't speak to them, right? We can't, like it's inaccessible. And so, but there's no, but what we're talking about here are different perceptual states, right? So I'm making that leap to say, look, different perceptual states, there's different states of consciousness. And now, why is this important? When we get back into the mental domain, right? Obviously, the way I'm leading all of this, we want to measure light as a metric for mental welfare, mental domain, right? Not because it's giving a sense of comfort, what we would do like as a lighting designer, right? But what it does for the opportunity of an animal to explore those different states. That's where we differ. We're not interested in comfort. What we're really interested is opportunity, right? And fitness. Like, what are the limits, right? What are we what's available to us, and what are the limits? That's a big difference for us in how we approach animal welfare in, say, a zoo or aquarium. We want to really introduce what are the opportunities to explore these different states, perceptual consciousness, in that condition. So anyway, this is a long way away, but it's actually still contained within the Zala stations, right?
Yes.
What we've done, we've inverted those 5 domains and put the mental domain first, right? That's a big difference. So we put the mental domain first, and then the other categories. What we do, environment, health, nutrition, behavior. What we do is show how light is important for each of those categories with metrics. But the metrics go beyond that, of course. There's the Singapore model is really what because of Claudia, we're really developing that Singapore model so that we're focusing on a measurable approach to mental health. So there's all the stations. The idea of these stations is to provide the data that then decisions can be made, right? You provide data, so a data-driven science, not to dictate what the outcome is going to be for a zoo or aquarium or a community for that matter. You could do this anywhere. You could do this in an animal research center, you could do it in a wetland, you could do it in a city. The idea though is that you provide the data that says, look, this is how far away we are from a natural condition that determined the fitness relationships. A zoo or aquarium then has the choice to say, this is affecting the mental health of my animal by limiting opportunity or limiting fitness relationships. This works for all the others too, for nutrition and nutrition in particular, but it goes down the line. So what these animal welfare stations do is that they provide this data. They also provide a public face. Zoos and aquariums are always under fire. They are always answering question, right? And it's a problem because these institutions represent the community relationships with animals, right? And some of them are publicly funded, some of them are private. But you take something like a SeaWorld, right? And we had board members from SeaWorld on our on the original our original board when ZLI was founded, right? And wonderful people actually. And but that being said, when that Blackfish movie came out, right? There are a lot of valid points in the Blackfish movie. I'll just say that right away. That being said, SeaWorld itself focused on wildlife conservation as well. It lost a lot of that, the ability to do that in the years preceding that movie, right? Because they didn't really respond to the public, relations well. And they didn't, and I don't just mean public relations, I mean how they handled their reaction to it. It wasn't good. It wasn't well done, in my opinion. But that being said, all that really good work that they were doing, it suffered. And they became more of an entertainment company. They still do fund that work. But for a while, they laid off so much of that staff that was responsible for animal care, the things you would want, and wildlife conservation. Now they're actually much larger than they were before Blackfish, much more financially lucrative now. But in part, it's because they switched focus to more of an entertainment venue
Okay, so
than an animal welfare, wildlife
let me
conservation.
let me switch back to the Zala thing here for a second. You had mentioned, I know
Yes,
we had
please.
later on in the talk we had talked about franchising, but you said that is it possible for other zoos and aquariums to become franchisees of the Zala Animal Welfare Station program?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for bringing it back to that.
Sure.
Um, yes, absolutely. The plan right now is that there are two different types of stations. One would be uh, ZLI owned, that a zoo or aquarium would host. And in that case, ZLI would, operate the staff. We would do day-to-day operations, provide the metrics as an independent presence on site. And that independence, because of the risk management and trust issues of a self-reporting facility, that independence we feel is really necessary. That's the first scheme.
Mm-hmm.
This by scheme I just mean plan in the European sense.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
The second scheme, the franchise scheme, which I always lead with, but the franchise scheme is actually to operate these stations, which involve an actual physical building on site. A yurt. We have them in yurts right now, but it's on site, so it's visible as an independent monitoring station. In that case, we understand that zoos and aquariums have little money, right? They do exhibits all the time, but those are always funded by external sources, generally. What we would offer in this case would be a new exhibit that's franchised. So
Okay.
a zoo or aquarium would invest in one of these using sponsors and donors. So they're investing in animal welfare. We provide the standards, just like any other franchise, opportunity that's out there. We provide the branding, we provide the metrics, which are really important. I mean, that is the brand, right? The Zala
But
brand.
do you need like
Uh,
it has to be a zoo or an aquarium and people that have scientific execution knowledge based on these metrics and caring for the animals?
um, the equipment actually and the monitoring, I think in both of these cases, there's a level of expertise that they need.
Mm-hmm.
In the first case, ZLI will do the hiring, and we will
Yes.
put people on site locally. In the second instance, that could be zoo or aquarium staff,
Mm-hmm.
because if it's franchised, like any other franchisee, they would take care of the employees. They would, and no, granted, we would provide training, we would provide updates, and we would use Species 360, which is one of the top, is the top data management service for WAZA, which is the World Association of Zoos and
Now,
Aquariums.
like the
We would
Toronto
use them
Zoo,
to
like
manage
a
the data.
Toronto Zoo could be a candidate for this. Like
Oh, absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah,
right, okay.
yeah.
And what about
And
private zoos? Like what about smaller? I know they've shut down. There used to be a lot of private zoos in Ontario, and those were the best ones to go to because you would have a lion right in front of you. Like there would be a
yes,
lion right there. But a lot of them got shut down and stuff like that. But can these private zoos also participate in the Zala program?
absolutely. Absolutely. With the budget that we're looking at for a typical, let's say, flagship station, it's typically a $3 to $5 million budget. And if you think of, a cost, to
Hmm.
get these things set up and running.
Wow.
But if you look at, well, I know it sounds like a lot, but if you look at, say, like any new exhibit in a zoo, you're talking 10,
Sure.
20, $30 million projects.
Oof.
And
That's all.
essentially, this is yeah, I mean, something like, and it depends, of course, on the scale of the zoo, but development is expensive. Public development. So we're much lower than that. But what we're saying, though, with these exhibits, they're not a one-off.
Mhm.
What they are is an exhibit that qualifies the rest of the facility. Now, for a small zoo, what I would actually suggest is that they host a ZLI station. And something like that can be done for under $1 million. And again, what we would do is set up a small building on site, hire staff. The key is it has to be done in perpetuity, so we would have like a 5-year commitment. And the reason for that is it takes time to develop the community relationships where the reason for animal welfare is clear to the public. So, I mentioned the monitoring aspect of these Zala stations, but really a key component of them is that they link development in the community back to the zoo or aquarium. Let me say how that means. It would take like a $5 million exhibit, right? Which is a small exhibit for say, like something like the Toronto Zoo or whatnot. If you take something like that, right, you would typically get a sponsor in the community. Could be a bank, could be, a soft drink company, it could be anything, right? And the money's important. But what we would ask with the Zala station is that we get SDG, Sustainable Design Goal, commitments from those sponsors. So in Toronto, where you have bird collision mitigation, is there's good awareness around that issue. What we would say is that if we wanted to make the Toronto Zoo completely bird friendly, no exterior exposed glass, right, and that's without treatment of some kind, the way we would handle that would be to say, and the Zala station would be there to do the monitoring that would make it evident why this is important. But for that next step in fixing any issues, what we would do is set up a mitigation plan. So, with a master plan in a zoo, typically there'll be, projects, listed out. Okay, in 5 years, we want to do, a new gorilla exhibit. We want to do a new, aviary. We want to do a hospital. What we would do as kind of preventative care is say, okay, these are the areas of a zoo or aquarium that need remediation, right? We want to see these areas be bird friendly, or this applies for artificial light as well. We want to see these transformations. We can't do it all at once because it's too expensive. It's a problem. Instead, we lay the plan out so that, say, a bank would come in and say, okay, yeah, I will, as a bank, I will contribute to this project. But the zoo in turn will say, that's great, but your bank needs to be bird friendly too. So the bank in the community is then remediated along with that project in the zoo. And what that does, there are two sides to the benefit here. From the zoo itself, there's that benefit in that it gets its project done, but it also then has awareness in the community of the good work it's doing. So, when we talk about SeaWorld before, nobody knew of that good work. It wasn't publicized in the same way, as other types of endeavors. So that SDG commitment approach is really about generating awareness for the zoo going out. Now, for a bank, what that does is it becomes the sponsor that cares. And they do. And they get to show their clients, hey, look, you've got an issue. Bank with us, we're responsible, we'll open a dialogue. We're not simply a nameless, faceless corporation. We care about the environment because the environment is how you stay financially productive, right? So that marketing cascades. One of the big issues with bird collisions with windows is that you have these spectacular issues with high rises, right? You'll have 100 birds will fly into a glass tower, in a week, right? Or a day, even in some cases. But unfortunately, that's not the worst of it. The worst comes in suburban communities where you have glass next to foliage and birds. So the numbers are actually much higher in suburbia than they are, say, in a city. The only thing is you don't see it because it's one by one. It's like poverty. The only way you fix poverty is one by one, right? You can't do it all at once. So with something like this, getting back to the bank, rather than simply saying, "Oh, there's that zoo. Oh, zoos make me sad," or those suffering and all. It's not about that. It's about what are we going to do, right, in a practical sense. So this relationship between a bank and a zoo then goes to the suburban community by people who are using those services that are made aware of how they can fix a problem they didn't even know they had. So it may be something like screening on glass, right? Getting away from that idea that if you see something, it's transparent. When we all know that that's absolutely not the case, right? In terms of like business and finance. So, here, the next step would be, look, glass kills birds. No two ways about it. You have a glass, you have a bird, you have a dead bird, right?
Mhm.
So the next way around this is to say, well, how do we fix it? Do you do, and there's three ways basically. You can mark glass on the exterior, has to be on the exterior surface in a tiny, tight pattern that, doesn't leave openings that birds think they can fly through, or that the reflections aren't such that they fly into it. Or you can put screens, shades, shutters, a barrier basically in front of that window. Those work really well, and they have 2,000-year-old architectural history, to draw on as to what you might like to do. And then finally, you can replace that glass with a different strategy altogether. It might be something like, where instead of exposing the glass straight out, you have like the fins that you used to get in modern architecture. Or you might have translucent panels. Or you might have top lighting. So that's more for new development than it is remediating existing work. But there are ways to think about not exposing the birds to glass directly. And I was thinking of like a horizontal side tooth pattern. But anyway,
Mhm.
so those
Well,
three
I
strategies.
absolutely. Yeah, the bird glass thing is important. And I also stress when I talk about this that we haven't even invented all the solutions. That it's infinite how we could
Oh,
address
Mm.
yeah.
glass with birds, and that we've actually just stuck with the status quo of our current building
Mhm.
um,
Mm.
environment to just keep going with this as billions of birds die per year. I think it's so interesting the way that you talk about the different perceptual states of animals, Dr. Fisher. Um, the way that I talk about it in my uh, more poetic, less science. I'm not a scientist. I'm a citizen scientist, but I talk about it as the light of time. That there is something that happens in our senses of perception um, through the arc of the natural daylight cycle every day and every night. And so there, there's a moment that happens where you suddenly see the light is changing and it's dusk, and it changes your perception of the moment. And I do not think it is a leap to talk about the different perceptual states of animals. I think it is arrogant to think that they don't have different perceptual states.
Mm.
And so I think I read your article Enlightenment. It's a fantastically written article, listeners, and it's spelled IN Enlightenment, and it's definitely worth a read. And it really shows how far I think you are thinking outside of the box about what it's like to be a wildlife living thing on this planet outside of the human perspective, far beyond survival. It's very unromantic if we're only just talking about survival for species. Because if I lived every day trying to survive, that sounds like a very unpleasant life.
Mm.
So I think that's fantastic. And so, you brought up Blackfish, and I know that you work in film and media. And so, can you talk about some of what the work that you've done? You have an amazing film called Brilliant Darkness, Hotaru in the Night. And can you talk about the making of that film and what it did?
I can. With this would be sort of that third category of the things that you mentioned earlier, Mike, about what we do with ZLI. Our photodiversity films are a way that we can open up dialogue and conversation and engage. It's really it's photodiversity because it really does try to speak to diversity, inclusion, access, and engagement, right? DIAE, right? Is the current acronym for that. But so our photodiversity films, it's been around for 7 years now, I think. Um, Initially, we were focused on documentaries, and I'll speak to Brilliant Darkness. That actually came about because of Emily Driscoll. Is a wonderful filmmaker. If you look at Bonsai Films, BONSCI films, she makes a lot of different films. We were working in a co-working space, or I was working in a co-working space. I was introduced to her, and she said, "Look, you need to make a film because it'll establish your legacy." And I have no concept of legacy. I have to say that right off. Even like the concept of survival, I don't have that, right? I don't know what that is because I don't really have that view of an afterlife, right? So like survival and afterlife, they just don't fit in, right? Other than as an anthropologist, right, or an archaeologist. But that being said, when Emily suggested we make this film, I said, okay, we're going to make a film. And but then I was invited in my capacity with the Royal Institute of British Architects to speak in Tokyo after the Tohoku quake, after the Fukushima disaster, right, 3/11. I was invited to speak actually on light and lighting, and I was actually asked to speak saying that we need artificial light, right? That was the invitation, and these were new things for me at the time, kind of, and so, but I went and I looked at the situation. They were experiencing rolling blackouts. And my response at the time was, well, maybe you don't need as much as you think you do. And maybe we can start to redo this a little better because we're talking about community viability. So my response was, yeah, that's great, but that's not what I'm going to talk about this, right? Anyway, during the talk, there were two other speakers that struck me particularly. One was a photographer, Ray O'Hara, and the other was a teacher, Nobuaki Ochi. And Nobuaki Ochi became, he joined our board, and he was a representative of the International Dark Sky Association, and he was pushing for dark sky areas. He had done a study monitoring light throughout Japan, looking at the different light pollution levels. So he was really instrumental in that at the time. Ray O'Hara, for his part, was a wartime photographer who had a difficult experience, to say the least, in Mogadishu. And so he couldn't do it anymore because his anxiety was too much, right? So instead, he turned to photographing fireflies and baby seals, right? And as a way to relax, he thought this would be great. So anyway, I listened to the two of them speak, and I had spoken to Emily a few weeks before this, and so I said, if we're going to do a film, let's do this the right way. We're going to do it half in Japanese, right? Half English, half Japanese, because we want to respect the perspectives. And for anime, I'm more of a sub guy than a dub guy. I'll just say that right away. So I said, let's listen and see what things are here, right? And so we decided we would make our first photo diversity film following Ray O'Hara as he photographed fireflies. And we were going to do it again, half Japan, half the U.S. And that became the model for all of the photodiversity films. Every one has to have multiple languages in it. That's really one of those breaking points for us. And the reason is to make everybody a little uncomfortable, and to have to listen a little more. Right? I'm a big fan of that. Of making, so anyway, we got on the Emily and I, we got on the plane. We went to Tokyo, went down to Kyushu. Ray O'Hara had his secret spot, that he photographed, and we went to a few places. On the plane on the way down, and this was a slight faux pas on my part, but it worked out okay, so I can say this. I was looking at one of the tour guides in the back of the seat. They have the in-flight magazines, and I saw that Takachiho was there. And now Takachiho is a sacred site, if I translate it that way, in Shinto, where the goddess Amaterasu hid from the other gods, right? A bit out of petulance in the original story. But she hid, and she was the sun goddess, right? And they had to coax her out. So it had always been something that was near and dear to my heart. I knew this story fairly well. But I saw it was in Kyushu, near where we were set to film. So I changed the whole schedule on the plane, which isn't really something you do in Japan. I found out later. But I changed the whole schedule, and I said, this is what we're doing. We're going here. So we did. Now, the reason I bring that up, with Takachiho, it points out the emotional complications of light and the intricacies in how it's buried in cultural heritage, and but in a very personalized way. Listening to the petulance of Amaterasu as a sun goddess, you lose a little bit of this in different tellings of the story, but the one I first was exposed to was that. It was very important because it related these emotional states to much bigger things, like a bigger in the sense. Now I would actually put the emotional state first, but it puts things like light and environment and nature and survival in a context that's very much related to how we engage with others. So we started off with that. That was like really one of the most important parts of that film shoot for me. The other aspects, Ray O'Hara, it turns out, never really lost his anxiety. And this is really the second point of this, that when we went out to film, he confessed that it was kind of nice to have a crew around him. Normally he would go out by himself, but he confessed it was kind of nice to have the crew around because it was comforting to be in these remote spots where you can hear monkeys in the trees, you can hear the water rushing, which masks the sound, so you only get little glimpses of sound through the roads. When cars pass by, and they do occasionally, it not only disrupts everything, which it's an astoundingly painful experience when a car drives past one of these sites, but it also, you have the nerves of not knowing who's in that car. And so if you're out there by yourself, the anxiety is just awful, right? So anyway, the point of this is he had moved from one situation surrounded by anxiety into another, doing this work seeking relaxation. That the light was still very much artificial light was still very much disrupting to that experience. Personal company wasn't, right? So for me, what that meant is that, this dialogue and engagement, it's a way to move past anxiety. Now, I say that's important, and this is turning into a long story, but I say this is really important because when we deal with something like light pollution, right, or we deal with artificial light, the expression security light, that's a misnomer. There's no such thing as a security light, right?
Totally
And
agree.
right, it's a horrible misapplication. It's an inversion, right? But when we talk about something like that, right, it gets to the heart of the matter, that we're really not fighting necessity here. As say, like, if we say we want to reduce, reuse, recycle, or, or any other environmental parameter, we're not fighting necessity, we're fighting aesthetics, right? Because you can always find different ways. I'm very much a firm believer in creativity, right? And I believe in, like, that people are smart, right? And they, if they let go of the things holding them back, or if they're freed from them, like economic hardship, things like that, they're capable of creating incredible things. So, we're thinking about development and artificial light and glass and asphalt, it's another big problem. If we think about all of this stuff, supporting people and freeing them from that anxiety is the primary task, right? That's the primary goal. That's what we have to do. Our task
When you're
is
talking
freeing people
about
from anxiety.
removing
Sure.
the anxiety, what do you mean? Because I want to interject
Mm,
here. We
please.
had a guest on, Samyukta Manikumar, and she had a really interesting approach, which was to say, kind of like let people be and have the feelings that they're going to have. And
Mm,
as humans are diurnal and we're active during the day most naturally, there is a natural fear, a helpful and useful fear of the dark. So when you say
mm.
removing anxiety, what do you mean? Because I don't think we'll ever really truly remove it, which is partly why we have that feeling of awe, that discomfort, that sense of. So, yeah, what do you mean about that?
Well, I would start off from a different position. In that, I wouldn't call fear of the dark natural, or I wouldn't call humans diurnal, actually. And the reason for that, if I look at other that's a cultural preoccupation, I would say. One very much tied to the rise of the lighting industry. If you look back at, in different historical settings, cultural settings, right? Um, Interpretation of the stars, for example, right? As fortune telling. If you look at something like the Pantheon, right? That oculus, it's not there to see the sun. It's there actually to divine what the future of life is around the movement of stars and planets, right? Um, so I would start from a very different place, right? And when I say free from anxiety, I don't mean being freed from natural emotions. because I don't know what a natural emotion is, right? There are conditions that sets these things up. And a good explanation would be if I go to the movies and I watch a comedy, right? Now granted, people in the room will have different emotions related to that comedy. Some will feel pity, some will feel, anger, some will feel contempt, some will feel enthusiasm, some will feel joy. There's a range that the same people will have in that room. Very different relationships to that film, but all of it's been set up by the conditions of the film, right? That applies for me. I'm not asking anybody to come with me on this, but that applies for me in general, right? So if I, the way I always describe it to myself is that I didn't invent my language, right? I didn't invent my language. It came from somewhere else. And yet I can't imagine my identity without it, right? I have so many ways to describe the room around me, my experiences that are based in the words that I speak. There's no feeling apart from that, right? Even though feelings generate, and people will say, you have nonverbal communication, all of that. That's fine, but they're all expressions and relations of expression to each other. So to me, that freedom from anxiety that I'm talking about, right? What I'm talking about is freedom from very unnatural conditions that create anxiety, that are
I see.
outside of
Yeah.
myself, right?
Hmm.
So I do, obviously I disagree on like certain levels, but it's really the freedom from unnatural conditions that are perceived as inevitable, but they're not,
That's
right?
amazing.
I actually
That
don't
that's the way I would
disagree
think of
with
it.
what you
I think
said at
that's
all.
amazing, actually.
Yeah. Yeah. I think
Yeah.
it's a great way to say, if you think about agriculture and the
Mm.
sleep 4 hours, wake up 4 hours, it's true. Diurnal is probably too strong a word for what we are. So I think I'm glad I asked. That was very clarifying. And Mike, you wanted to
Oh,
jump
I
in.
appreciate it.
Yeah, I just wanted just to confirm because I kind of got it answered by you and Jane there just in the dialogue. But you're saying that the humans aren't necessarily a diurnal species, which I thought was an
Mm.
interesting way to say it. You said not necessarily. You didn't say they weren't or they were, right? And the second thing that you said is that we're conditioned to fear the dark. That Jane, that's something that's never come up on the show before. We've assumed that it's natural, that humans naturally fear the dark, and that's part of it. And there's also this awe experience that humans naturally have, and we'd like to restore the awe experience. But this is the first time I've ever heard, and I mean, you're a physicist, you're a scientist, you study these things. So I'm assuming this is coming from over the course of a career, you're coming to these conclusions
Mm.
that, hey, this fear of the dark thing, this may actually be something that's culturally created. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean,
Wow.
there's not even
Wow.
a hesitation in my mind
Hmm.
anymore. And actually, a gentleman that I got friendly with over the years, his name's Travis Longcore, right? And most people know his book. It's called he and Catherine. It was Catherine Rich's book that the two of them edited, right? But he actually pointed out, that there was always a thing called second sleep in Europe, right?
Hmm.
And again, like you have to focus on very specific contexts. But there's always a thing called second sleep, meaning that most people would wake up around 1 o'clock, maybe midnight, maybe a little later. And then for an hour or two, they would putter around, do the things they needed to do, right? And then go back to sleep. But again, it really depends on the specific cultural context. As for fear of the dark, I would say even like for contemporary life, right? And like sort of like modern fear of the dark. This actually speaks to a huge problem that I'm going to get to next. But but if you ever think about how we treat little kids, right? If I have an infant, right, as a father or a 1 year old or a 2 year old, I will put a nightlight in their room,
Hmm.
thinking, oh, you're going to be afraid of the dark. Here, let me put a nightlight so you can see, right? When actually, again, if you fall asleep under starlight and there's a shred of moonlight, you're actually much more sensitive to movement, and you're more capable of dealing with threats. So for a baby, of course, that just means screaming and crying, if something comes in,
Hmm.
moves in the room. But as adults, as contemporary modern adults, we will put nightlights in thinking that, oh no, that's not what we want. We're going to avoid that whole scenario of something moving, the baby crying, right? So you put in these imaging functions, right? And this gets back to that idea of state. So consciousness. I think one of the challenges we have right now, when we talk about humans as diurnal, really what we're talking about in terms of applied photobiology is we're talking about that photopic imaging, right? About imaging, because at night when our eyes adapt, down to the low levels and we're more motion sensitive, um, that's fine, but we don't see images. We don't resolve sort of that full on optical information, right? We have a different kind of information that we process. In the daytime, we see images, right? But when we talk about photopic vision, it's that imaging that comes first. So at night, if I'm using artificial light, it means I can image, right? I create images with my system. I don't respond to motion because we want to put that away from us, right? Threat response. We want to put that away. Um, Instead, we want to image because we can keep working, right? And yesterday was Labor Day in the U.S., right? So like working, there's lots of sides to working, of course.
Sure.
But with something like reading or find task or those kinds of things, right? That all depends on imaging in the way it's been set up. But it's not biologically inevitable or relevant or even appropriate, for the different times of day. It's a move away from a fitness condition that survives for a lot of reasons. I mean, it allows for expansion and, and growth, but it's not necessarily healthy in the sense of providing a sustainable mode of engagement with the environment. So it fits labor, but not sustainability. And, so like that, and it's a bit tricky because the wording, we all speak in words, and it's difficult to move to something else, right? But the idea of humans as diurnal, it's really takes us away, I think, from what's going on in terms of these ecological relationships, where that imaging is really what's going on. So in a way, like saying diurnal is a way to say, oh, we're imaging animals, which is true, but it's only true in a certain industrial context. And so it's a bit different.
So,
and again, and this isn't to say any political position like that. It's just, but it is lying out like a history of what's going on.
so I want to follow up with another question. So the diurnal, so not a diurnal species, so that, they talk about the circadian rhythm, but is it possible to postulate that the problem is not that people don't sleep at night? The problem is that they're exposed to electric light or artificial light at night.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, and, the best example of this, if you ever go to the beach and, you lie down on the sand, I don't know anybody who doesn't sleep. If you're lying in the sand under the full baked sun, you're going to sleep. This is one of the reasons why we go to that integrative biology. What's going on? Now, sleep's really important, right? But the timing of sleep is very different from the biological function, right? Timing and function are very different things. With the timing, when we say circadian rhythm, right? Essentially, it is the light. You're absolutely right. It's the light that's the issue. You have hypersensitive, light-sensitive ganglion cells in the back of your eyeball, and those tie into the pineal gland, right? Through the hypothalamus and the pineal gland, right? And that governs just that little bit of hormone cycling, but it's enough like a carburetor to change your whole system. So, but that's suppressed by light, right? That production is suppressed by both artificial light, or if daylight were 24/7, you wouldn't have that, right? But you do. It's the light that matters in the way we're talking about it for hormone cycling. So if we talk about mental health or reproductive health, environmental health, dietary health, any of the axes, the endocrine axis in the body, they're impacted by this. It all comes around that presence of artificial light. So technically, if you had no artificial light, you could sleep in the day, function at night. It'd be absolutely fine, in terms of circadian rhythm. You still have to sleep, It's just the when and the where. Another way to say this, and I don't mean to harp on this, and Jane, I apologize because I know like where the comments come from sometimes. But with something like diurnal, if we were diurnal species, right, there would be no point in staying awake at night or functioning at night. We would just keep that rest period.
I agree
But
with you. What I
mm,
want to say is, though, I think
sure,
that you're right. Diurnal is, and you've opened my eyes to this, is a limiting term, and it's not accurate. I mean, we're also crepuscular. We also are
hmm,
nocturnal because we're up till all ends. So the word is very
yeah,
limiting, and it's a really good point. What I was trying to actually convey, though, is that, humans by nature are more comfortable in lit environments,
mm,
regardless of the time of day. And something that I advocate so much in my work is that we need to reacquaint ourselves with the beauty of the night, and that there's so much there that we're leaving behind. So I think your
mm,
expansion of what humans are, diurnal, nocturnal, crepuscular, or whatever other adjectives there are to describe activities during a time of day, I think you're so right that there's even been different models over time. So I love your expansion of these definitions outside of the language that we've been given, because that can also be limiting. As you're saying, we've adopted English as our language, but it could be expanded and renewed. So I totally hear your point there, and I think it's fascinating. And what I was really just trying to say is that I think there's also an innate fear of darkness that we do have to work with, and I don't think it will go away. As you said, with your the person who you worked with in Japan said he never got rid of his fear of the dark because it's useful. It's a useful emotion to wonder what the
oh,
crunching behind you is, but in the darkness that you can't see. And now
you
I'll
know,
give you a minute to jump in, and I just want to
no,
wrap
of
up. So I'm
course,
going to give you your
sure, I'm sorry,
last
yeah.
question before you jump in with that response. But I just want to know, in addition to what you're about to say, why does night matter to all living things on Earth? And what is your great hope for ZLI in the future?
Okay, I'll follow through, and I will. I'll just kind of do my insert because like everybody will use. With Ray O'Hara, it's not the dark he's afraid of; it's other people
Hmm.
because he saw what other
Okay.
people can do, right?
Hmm. Yes.
Hmm.
And I mean, I
Interesting.
think it's a very legitimate fear actually
Hmm.
over the years.
Hmm.
And so, but it wasn't so much the darkness; it was that sort of that hedgehog dilemma of people getting close and far, and trying to figure out that balance in the right environment. Um, but that being said, I think with ZLI, my goal for ZLI is actually to survive by leading appropriate conversations. And I say it that way because, we don't need to be the new WWF or WCS or we don't need, or Nat Geo. We don't need that. What we need to do is actually address fundamental uh, uh, community challenges. Right? We're here to serve the community. Those we're a nonprofit, so we're here to serve the community. That means that our mission comes first in anything we do. Now, I want financial success. I think it'd be great if our films won anime awards and Oscar awards going forward. We didn't talk about like Beached and our anime films, but that's of course I want all that, and I want the funding. So like if people are interested in applied photobiology, right? Or in the consequences of thinking about that in their decisions, right, to improve that. That's what I want. I want to make sure that we build a community capable of sustaining this mission for community good. So it's supporting the sciences of light and life through the arts for animal welfare and wildlife conservation. Each one of those mission aspects is absolutely vital for a number of reasons, which would take another 2 hours to get into. But each one of those aspects, science, arts, animal welfare, wildlife conservation, they're all important to attend to. That's that's why it's a complicated mission like that. So I think for ZLI, I want to see the Zala stations adopted. I want one in Toronto. You know, I want to see one. In every country on the planet. And in fact, we're on our road to getting there. We're in the process of securing a WAZA membership, World Association of Zoos and Aquariums. And we are a JAZA supporter in Japan, Japanese Association of Zoos and Aquariums, an AZA conservation partner here in America. And we work with IATSA as well, and I shouldn't say work with. No, actually, no, I can't say work with. Um, but overall, though, the goal is to develop this conversation globally, using zoos and aquariums to reach audiences, to emphasize how important animals are and how important light is to those animals for their daily lives, things like mental health, food security. So overall, with CLI, you know, it really has to be a forum for these conversations. That's really my goal. And by forum, I mean partner in dialogue. So that's what we're about. And between the WAZA membership coming up, which I'm thrilled about, and all of the other partners that we've developed and conversations here, I think all of this is really important going forward. So that's what I want, at the end of the day.
Okay, I have a question that relates to the
Sure.
lighting industry.
Yeah.
So, do you think, and we're trying to convince, so Jane and I both work in the lighting industry, and we're trying to make the case for the restoration and preservation of natural darkness. But really, I think that the lighting industry, as it pertains to outdoor lighting, should make that its single goal. That whenever we're dealing with, it's not a secondary thought. It's not about the stars specifically, but that outdoor lighting in the lighting industry should be pursued through the lens of the restoration and preservation of darkness. Would you agree with that? And is there anything that you have to add to that?
Um, I guess my it's a great goal. I say my approach to it would be understanding the difference between natural light at a particular time and the conditions you're facing. And so rather than say having like task-oriented metrics, have a difference metric.
Hmm.
And we can do that actually with Zala. Look and Danny Nielsen at Lund University is really kind of a good guide in this in looking at the fields of light. With the lighting industry, I think that goal of understanding what it already has in natural light, right? So rather than a lighting industry to become a light industry, meaning that, like in the daytime, daylighting for buildings, really important. And again, it's a full range of light. Daylight is very important. I rarely talk about it because I don't need to. There's tons of people doing it. But thinking about, how do you live indoors, right? When you have these orders of magnitude that really intense that we'd normally be exposed to, but we live indoors now, right? So how do we accomplish that, right? But the key in all, and of course with nighttime, recapturing starlight, moon cycles, those are vital, right? Absolutely vital for human health, safety, and well-being, to be able to recoup, um, or to recognize that natural light is the baseline, right? Rather than task being a baseline, natural light is the baseline. And for a lighting industry, I say this often. I mean, for the lighting company that realizes that natural light comes first, it immediately gains an advantage. Now, that might mean that instead of simply selling lighting systems, it gets into things like contrast ratios, the optics of materials, which back in the 70s we used to look very closely as architects and lighting designers, like Bill Lamb, like we mentioned Bill Lamb. I mentioned Bill Lamb a lot because I got to work with him for a little bit back in the 90s. And, you would focus on material uh, properties of light, right? We don't do that as much anymore. That's a mistake. So it means for something like a lighting company, figuring out how to incorporate that light design through the use of material, into its business model will have a huge advantage. because at the end of the day, the products will be more efficiently used. So rather than simply say like, if, and as an example, if I have a loading dock and I light the loading dock without understanding the difference, say, between a black asphalt tarp, ground and a white concrete ground, and how that changes visibility, it changes the productivity both of the installation, the finances of that, first costs, and then operating costs. So if I'm able to incorporate those operating costs into the budget and the planning, set it on a plan with a client that gets a repeat client back, so that it's not a one-off sale, it's an ongoing relationship, right? There's a lot of money to be made there. And that's, so I think with the lighting industry, you're absolutely right. Recouping darkness, very important, right? Even if I don't use the word, so like recouping, like natural, like placing natural light first, right? But then doing it in such a way that realizing that every single material object in a field, like in a room, in a landscape, they're all lighting fixtures. Right? This is kind of like one of these like little physics observations. Whenever a material is struck by electromagnetic radiation of optical range, right? I mean, it happens outside of that too, of course, but it doesn't simply bounce off; it's absorbed, and the material emits new radiation,
Sure.
which we see and pick up as light. That means that every single element in a development is a light fixture. And the available light that's already there, right, is already creating that new range of lighting fixtures that you have to deal with. Now, you can either go in blindly to that, which is the way it's done. You can go in blindly to that, emissions of light from materials in space due to, due to ambient radiation, right, ambient light, or you can go in understanding it and then doing your installation in a way that's complementary to that, that gets you what you're doing, but much more efficiently. And the efficiency leads to economic productivity because you're not wasting the sales. And that makes less expensive products, both short-term and long-term for clients. It means that you can market to those clients in such a way that you're selling them, cost efficiency in a real way. Because people are smart. We always go back to this. People are smart. They will figure it out, if it's laid out properly. So anyway.
Yeah, so it's interesting, Jane. Dr. Fischer says what I say. It's a lighting boom. Let's get started on it, Jane. Dark sky lighting boom. Let's go.
Yeah, I think there's so much work to be done, and I love that you underscore that natural light is the baseline. How I often say it is the natural daylight cycle is our Rosetta Stone, and that is really what we should be emulating and mimicking as much as possible in our work. So thank you so much, Dr. Fischer, for coming on. I think that you approach things you just have a naturally different point of view, and it is extremely valuable to breaking apart our current method, which is not scientifically based. It is based in ease and comfort of humans. And so I really appreciate how much you changed the language and your perspective and your angle into this topic. It's been fascinating to talk to you about it. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, and I'm very grateful for the chance to come on. I would give a pitch for the charity. We're always in need of sponsors, and either zli.org or www.zoolighting.org. Both of those work. But we're always looking to work with people as a way to move things forward. So love to be a charity of choice of the lighting industry. So, but I say that because I've got to give the plug. But thank you so much. I really do appreciate the time. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Starving for Darkness just finished up. I love that show so much, Greg Eric. What a hot blaster. But we got to talk about Evluma, the supporters of Starving for Darkness. EVLUMA.com. Hover over products and click Dark Sky Friendly Lighting to first the magical Evluma, brother.
That's right. They're doing it right and having the products you need to actually meet dark sky compliance or dark sky friendly facilities. They cover Kelvin temperature, lensing, diffusion, shields, dimming, everything you need with 2 products, Area Max and OmniMax. So check that out.
Come on, folks. Go to evluma.com. That's EVLUMA.com. Hover over products and click Dark Sky Friendly Lighting. The Magicians. Starving for Darkness loves you. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.